Hi, today I'm going to walk you through the very basics of Photoshop and everything you need to know to get started and to maneuver around this rather confusing interface. This tutorial is meant for beginners who just got Photoshop and who are wondering how to use it. I'm not going to teach any specific skills. I'm just going to give a brief overview on how to use Photoshop so that you can get used to it and start learning more skills through other tutorials that you can find. So the version that you have might be a little different from the Photoshop version that I have. I'm working with CS6, but you may have Photoshop CC. The interface might be a little different, but the main points should still remain consistent. The first thing you have to do is create a file. You can't really do anything in Photoshop until you create a new file. The final product that you make in Photoshop is usually going to be in the form of an image, and that means that you're going to have to decide on the size of the image that you're going to make. It may seem very confusing having all these numbers and all these options, but it's essentially the width and the height of the photo that you're going to create. This is the color. I usually don't worry about the resolution. Usually leave it at 72 pixels per inch. And the color, I use RGB. That's kind of the most common color scale that you use. You can use other color scales, but just stick with RGB. That's what I like to do. Background contents, white, or you can choose any solid color, or you can choose for it to be transparent. You can change this at any time while you're working after you make your file, so don't worry about it too much. So if you click on this drop down menu, you can decide on the measurements that you want to work in. It's most common to work in pixels when you're doing digital artwork, or anything to do with digital pictures, that is. And this might be a useful number to remember, 1920 by 1080p, and that's the size of an image that is 1080p in resolution. But click OK when you're done, and you'll be given this big square in the middle. And this square is basically going to be the product that you end up making, the final thing that you're making. So let's start on the left-hand side with the tools. So all these icons are their own little tools that allow you to do different things in Photoshop. And there's a lot of them, and they do very specific things. And if I'm being honest, I personally don't know everything that every single tool does. But I do know I am comfortable with enough tools to the point where I can do everything that I need to do in Photoshop. So there are common tools like the Move tool, the Select tool, the Brush tool, the Eraser tool, the Paint Bucket tool, which is usually paired with the Gradient tool. If you don't see it on your tool menu, that might be why. The Text tool, the Pen tool, the Rectangle or the Shape tool, and obviously zooming in and zooming out. The magnifying tool. One thing you might want to note is that if your tool has a little triangle on the bottom corner, it means that you can right click it and select different variations of that tool. So, if you have an eraser tool and you right click it, there might be a background eraser tool, and a magic eraser tool, which does something more specific. If you want to create specific shapes, there's a rectangle tool, a rounded rectangle tool, an ellipse, and so on. You get the point. The reason why I say that you don't have to know what every single tool does is because there's a bunch of ways you can get to the same product. And let me give you a very simple example. If you want to make a rectangle in Photoshop, you could simply take out the rectangle tool and make a rectangle. But another way you could do it is you could create a rectangular selection and go to the Brush tool and fill in that selection, and in the end those two things will be the same thing, but achieved through different paths and different tools that you use. So that's why I say that there's really no need to stress yourself and learn every single tool that there is and every single thing that they can do, because once you get comfortable with a fine selection of tools, then you can do pretty much everything that you need to do. So another cool thing you might want to keep in mind is if you're using a tool and you want to move around, you want to go to this space, you can press space and hold it and just drag and move, and you'll be able to move your interface that way. Now let's move on to the right hand side. First of all, color. You can click on any of these boxes and now you can really select literally any color out of this spectrum. Another cool thing is that if you bring your mouse outside, you can select specific colors. So if you have an inspiration image that you're working with and you want to find the exact color that they use, then you can click the eyedropper tool to really get that exact color. So that comes in useful, but there's really not much to it. It's very self-explanatory, and color is, quite easy to work with. Adjustments and styles, there's a lot that you can do with this, but I don't really mess around with it because I personally don't know how to use them. When it comes to very specific projects, you can learn to use them, but for the sake of this video, I won't really be covering any of these. The most important part is probably the layers tab. If you don't see this exact option, then you might want to, kind of shift around and find the layers tab. The most useful thing, probably the most useful thing in Photoshop is the fact that you can use layers. And this really goes for pretty much every digital art app or program that you can use. And if you're already familiar with that, great. There's not much you have to learn. But if you've never used anything to do with layers, it may get very confusing at first. But the way they work is basically layers that are stacked on each other. If they're at the top, if they're near the top, that means they're above the first layer. So anything below will be covered, and you see what I mean. So when I bring this layer above the second layer, you'll see whatever's on the first layer. If you bring it down, you won't see it because the second layer is covering it. Make sure that you're working on the right layer. It will lead to very, very stressful and very inconvenient times. For example, is what I did here. It's very easy to get confused and think that, all this black is on one layer, but when I painted, so then you would be like, okay, then I'll just delete this layer. But wait, you made a mistake and you painted the black on layer 1 as well. And when you're working on a very elaborate project, it may cost you a lot of time to kind of undo and redo everything that you did, especially if you're making very fine selections. So make sure that you're working on the right layer, and make sure that you've actually selected a layer when you're doing something, because if you haven't selected it, it'll give you a warning saying that you have to select a layer. If you want to create a new layer, you can go to this at the bottom where it says create new layer. You can click on this icon and you can create as many layers as you want, and you can work with as many layers as you want. If you want to duplicate a certain layer, you can just click on the layer and Control J or Command J, and you can duplicate it. If you want to merge certain layers, you can select them all and click Control E or Command E to merge them, and that makes them into one layer. Those might be quite useful to know. So those are the absolute basics that you have to know in order to start using Photoshop. I know that this doesn't really cover a lot, but hopefully it's helpful to every beginner who has just got Photoshop and have no idea what they're doing. I think the best way to learn Photoshop is to learn how to do very, very specific things when you want to work on a project. So say, for example, if you want to create a certain effect with a text, then I would look for a tutorial specific to what you want to do, and take little bits and aspects of the tutorial and learn really how to maneuver around certain things and how to use certain tools and effects, and etc. I think it's very ineffective to just sit through a course and learn everything there is to know about Photoshop, because Sometimes they're not practical, and sometimes they're not really relevant to what you intend and what you want to do. The way I learned it is through very specific tutorials, and I think that's, again, the best way to learn it. Hopefully this basic overview eased you in to the world of Photoshop, and from here you can branch out to learn more specific things. If you have any questions, you can leave it in the comments. I'll be responding. And if you have any specific tutorials that you'd like me to do, leave it in the comments below. But for now, thank you for watching.
We can make it if we try. All the two